Thanks, Vicky, for that great introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. Just quickly, if you see me peering over my right shoulder, our son's home from daycare today, so we may have a special guest. So it's great to be here today, and I look forward to sharing with you the Trends in Medication Management section of our TELUS Health Annual Conference. So for today, in terms of our content outline, we're going to start off with our drug therapy class insights for 2021, as we do in most years. We've then got an interesting adherence analysis, looking at the potential impact of adherence on disease progression and drug costs. We'll briefly touch on the Canadian biosimilar landscape as it relates to how provinces are handling biosimilars. A quick legislative update, touching on national pharmacare and PMPRB updates. We're then going to look at COVID-19 insights, looking at the potential impact that COVID has had on patients seeking care, as well as their behaviors as to where prescriptions were dispensed. And we'll wrap up with a view into the drug pipeline. So just before we dive into our 2021 drug therapy class insights, let's kick things off with a polling question for the audience. Which drug class had the largest year-over-year growth percentage in total eligible costs? Was it inflammatory diseases, skin disorders, stimulants, or ulcers? All right, so it looks like just short of half of the group of the audience believes the largest year-over-year growth was in the inflammatory diseases. So let's continue on to find out. So here's a familiar slide that we look at each year, and the same slide that Sean had presented last week. This is the top 10 drug classes by eligible amount. Now, when we look here, I would say the key takeaways are that the top 10 are still the top 10 with minimal movement between them. We've only seen a flip of the 4th and 5th ranked categories, as well as the 6th and 7th ranked category switching spots. Again, at the top are inflammatory diseases, as well as diabetes. Now, I just want to note that inflammatory diseases includes a spectrum of conditions, such as rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's, and ulcerative colitis as a few. And a new drug will be flagged into these categories based on the first approved indication. So we will be focusing on the following 4 categories for a more detailed look at interesting trends within each therapeutic area. The first one being inflammatory diseases and diabetes, as they're the number 1 and number 2 category. The third one is asthma, as it fell from number 4 to number 5 and saw a corresponding decrease in overall costs. And finally, a look at stimulants or ADHD medications. Now, if we think back to the polling question from one slide ago, this was the correct answer for our polling question, as it saw a year-over-year increase of 19.2%, and we'll take a closer look as to why. Now, this year, we'll also be providing you with a short view into the pipeline for most of these categories, as well as plan management tools for the inflammatory and diabetes classes. So just before getting started, I'll orient everyone to these slides. If you look at the top, you'll see the total eligible costs in 2021, along with the growth rate beside the dollar amount. And the products that we'll be speaking to are listed at the top of the chart, along with their annual average cost per claimant. Now, looking at this category, which is inflammatory diseases, we wanted to see what was happening with the top 3 molecules for which biosimilars have come to market: infliximab, adalimumab, and etanercept. Now, each of these 3 molecules has had a different path post-biosimilar introduction, and we'll see how that turned out over the past few years. So here, first off, we're taking a look at infliximab, for which Remicade is the originator biologic for this molecule. Now, biosimilars have been on the market for some time now, but we have seen continued growth of the originator, along with strong growth of the biosimilars in the past few years. So the takeaway for me from this is that the overall infliximab market continues to grow, and this may likely be due to a couple of factors. The first one of continued growth of the originator may be due to confidential agreements which drive cost savings while maintaining plan member choice. Another factor is the dosing of this product can be weight-based and has a range. So we may be seeing dose escalation within the allowable dosing range, leading to continued growth of the molecule. And finally, as it relates to the growth we're seeing in the biosimilars, they continue to see stronger growth in recent years compared to when they first came to market. And this is likely due to switching programs, for which we're seeing now more commonly accepted as provinces and private payers both implement such programs. On this slide, we're looking at the adalimumab market, for which the originator is Humira. Now, the year-over-year growth of the biosimilars here is showing as 0%, but this is due to the fact that these products came to market in 2021. We do see a slight leveling off of the cost curve for the originator Humira, which may be linked to the introduction of biosimilars in the marketplace, but we have not seen a large drop in the utilization of the originator. One thing to note on this slide, I would say the average costs that are being shown for the biosimilars is underrepresented, as these products came to market within 2021, and as such, we don't have a full year's worth of claims data to calculate a true average. Also, as patients start on biosimilar or switch to biosimilar mid-year, this also draws down the average cost that we see here. And finally, we're taking a look at etanercept products, with Enbrel being the originator biologic. Here we see growth of the biosimilars, but also a year-over-year continued decline in the utilization of the originator. And again, this could be due to a couple of factors. The first one I would think of is the acceptance of switching policies within Canada, which will cause some of this decline. And for Enbrel and also for Humira, the dosing of the product does not lend itself to dose escalation, as it's a fixed dose or fixed dosing schedule. And so there's minimal on-label room for dose escalation. And finally, some of the decrease in utilization of the brand originator Enbrel may be due to patients switching to other products and not necessarily switching to a biosimilar. This would have occurred in previous years as well, pre-biosimilar, but with most new patients starting on a biosimilar now, the originator does not have the same pipeline of new patients as it would have had in the past to balance out those patients who are moving on to a different course of treatment. Now, when we look at the pipeline, we focus in on rheumatoid arthritis products as part of the inflammatory disease class here. And what we see here are two products which are going to enter mature classes. The first being another TNF inhibitor, similar to the three molecules we reviewed earlier. And the second being another IL-6 inhibitor, joining Actemra and Kevzara. It will be interesting to keep an eye on these two products to see how they differentiate from existing options. Will it be similar efficacy but lower cost, which will be tough as the others do have biosimilar options? Or will they differentiate based on efficacy, but with a higher cost to comparators? And it's in this case that it's really important to evaluate the value for money of these products, as high-cost drugs can in fact provide value for money based on their overall efficacy and other factors. Here we're looking at two new products, both with new mechanisms of action. These are likely to be used in patients who are not responding to currently available treatments, as we anticipate with otilimab. And fenebrutinib is a small molecule, so an oral therapy, and may look to differentiate from other treatment options, which are typically injectables. Now, again, as new agents come to market, the opportunity cost here would be lost biosimilar savings if members would have otherwise started on a biosimilar to an existing drug. Now we'll take a look at plan management solutions. So taking a look at how we can manage costs in this category to support plan sustainability, we've highlighted three options, which we'll review with you. The first one here is what we call product listing agreements. Now, these are confidential agreements that are agreed to between a payer and a manufacturer, and the outcome and parameters of an agreement can vary greatly, but it may support the ability to offer plan member choice between an originator or a biosimilar. One thing to consider is the potential for COB impacts or coordination of benefit impacts when determining which solution is best for you. The second solution we've highlighted here is a prior authorization program. Now, this is likely a program that most plans have in place today, and which would prefer the biosimilar product for naive patients who are starting treatment. And then finally, as discussed earlier, biosimilar switching programs are definitely becoming more commonly accepted in Canada. As we start to see more provinces implement such programs, we also see private plans beginning to follow suit. And typically there's two setup options. The first one we call a hard switch, which is where the originator molecule is no longer covered and plan members must switch to the biosimilar. And the other one is what we call a soft switch. And this is very similar to a generic pricing or substitution setup, where the claim for an originator will pay, but it will cut back to the cost of the biosimilar. Now, just to provide some scope to the potential savings opportunity here, what we looked at is if 100% of claims for originators today had any of these three programs applied to them, with the assumption that the savings was linked to the biosimilar price point, it could represent up to 3.82% in savings at a block level. The second category we're looking at today is diabetes, which is the number 2 category on our block. As you can see across the top, eligible costs within the category rose by 9.1% in 2021, building on the 10% growth that was experienced in 2020. This year, we're going to showcase 2 different types of diabetes products. The first being glucose sensors, so Freestyle Libre and Dexcom, which are the first and third, those mentioned across the top. So these are both continuous or flash glucose monitoring systems and cost around the ballpark as someone who is testing 10 times per day using traditional blood glucose test strips. We saw extremely high growth in Freestyle Libre over the past few years, which continues into 2021 at a slightly lower rate. And we've added Dexcom to this chart. Although overall utilization this year is extremely low, we expect to see this rise in the coming year. And the reason for this is that Dexcom is moving from a direct-to-consumer model to a pharmacy-based distribution model and seeking coverage as a drug benefit, which would be similar to how other glucose monitoring products are covered. It'll be interesting to track this throughout 2022 to see how uptake occurs. But one thing to note is that this is typically covered under extended health plans. So it may mostly be a shift in coverage or a shift in budget, moving to a pharmacy distribution model where this drug is now covered from the drug benefit rather than extended health. The other 2 products on this chart that we've highlighted are Ozempic and Rybelsus. So Ozempic was here last year as well and continues to show sharp year-over-year growth. This is a once weekly GLP product compared to others, which may need a daily injection. It will be interesting, though, to see the impact of Rybelsus, which is an oral version of the same medication, but it does need to be taken daily. So it'll be interesting to see if we see patients switch and what the uptake of the daily oral version is compared to the weekly injection, and where new patients to this product land, whether it's the oral or the injection. Taking a look at the diabetes pipeline, we saw another entrant into the GLP-1 class, which is now quite mature with a handful of existing products. The early studies, however, of this product do show superiority across a couple of metrics related to diabetes control and weight loss. So it will be interesting to see what the final studies and approval looks like. We do also expect to see some generics for highly utilized brand products that are available today. There are many generic submissions with Health Canada across these 4 products, being Januvia, Tradjenta, Invokana, and Farxiga. We do expect to see generics for these products potentially as early as 2023, depending on the outcome of patent litigation. As these products are typically covered by provincial drug programs, we do expect the generic savings opportunity to be significant once available. And so now we'll take a look at how you can manage costs in this category to support plan sustainability. And we've showcased two options here, which we'll review with you now. The first program listed here is a step therapy program. So step therapy can be thought of as an automated way to check for prior use of certain treatments or therapies. In a way, it's automating a quote unquote prior auth check where the prerequisite criteria is simply previous use of a specific therapy or treatment. In this case, we have a step therapy program which can be used to support the continuous or flash glucose sensors where cost management is needed. The STEP therapy program does allow for coverage of these products to be opened up automatically should a patient or plan member have a previous claim for insulin, thus providing coverage for your insulin user plan members, while also creating a pathway for exceptions for other plan members who may want to use such a product, such as those who experience frequent hypoglycemia, those who may have hypoglycemia unawareness, or excessive glucose variability. The second program that we've showcased here at the bottom of the page is the ability to include quantity maximums to protect against off-label use. Certain GLP-1 molecules, such as Ozempic, have a separate product on the market, which is indicated for weight loss. Typically, the dosing used for weight loss is higher than that for diabetes. And so if you're looking to ensure your diabetics are provided with coverage while limiting off-label use, quantity limits would be one way to protect your plan from off-label use. This limits the annual coverage to the required dose used in diabetes. And you would expect someone who was using these products off-label from a diabetes perspective would exhaust their annual limits anywhere from 6 to 9 months into the year. Now, while quantity limits do not prevent off-label use in a category that has such high utilization, prior authorization may not be a feasible alternative given the volume of requests. The third category we're going to take a look at here, and this is the one that showed the highest year-over-year growth within a category itself, is the stimulants or ADD, ADHD treatments. As you'll see, there was a growth of 19.2% this year compared to 2020. And we have seen growth across the class and across most molecules, but the largest growth was definitely in two molecules, which were Vyvanse and Concerta, and the generics were Concerta. We wanted to take a deeper dive into the data to better understand why we're seeing such high growth in this category of products, which has been around for quite some time. Our initial hypothesis was that this may be linked to more students having been home these past few years and parents were noticing certain behaviors or having interacted with them for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and may have led to a greater number of consultations with physicians. What was interesting is that we actually saw the majority of this growth was driven by adults, which we define as anyone over 18. So now this may be linked back to our initial hypothesis of having school-age children being at home, but instead of the children, it appears it was actually us, the adults, noticing certain behaviors in ourselves and potentially seeking medical advice. Looking at the pipeline in this category, we did find it interesting that manipulation-resistant technologies featured in a couple of new products, which have both been recently approved in the United States. We are unsure, though, if they will make their way to Canada. And very similar to other categories, we're seeing new entrants into classes with existing products. Viloxazine has been approved in the US, but similarly, we're unsure when and if it will come to Canada. We have not called out any specific plan management tools for this class of drugs, as the most common would be a generic substitution or pricing program for generics where available. And we do expect that to see a generic for Vyvanse as well, but not until 2024. And the final therapeutic area that we wanted to showcase was asthma. As mentioned, asthma dropped down one spot into number 5 compared to last year. And as we can see from the total eligible cost figure in 2021, a reduction in total eligible cost of 8.5% occurred. So this may be due to lower seasonal respiratory illness, with many of us staying indoors throughout the flu season. And so many of those one-off claims for asthma treatments were not required. But although the class has trended lower in 2021, I did want to flag two products which did see growth in year. These two products are both biologics used to treat asthma. And given the annual cost of these biologics being much higher than traditional inhalers or oral products, it will be something to track over the year to see if utilization of these products continues to grow, even in double digits, as we see here with benralizumab at nearly 40% year over year. So this is something to keep an eye on, and we'll see what happens to the asthma class overall going into next year. I wanted to end this section by taking a look at the top 10 most costly products on a per claimant basis. Looking at this slide, I wanted to make just a couple of points. The first one is that these are typically indicated for rare diseases, which also aligns with their price point. That being said, it's also typically a very small number of patients, so the impact to an individual plan can be very large. We're seeing growth year over year as well with respect to the overall cost that these top 10 most costly products represent, growing 11% from last year up to $52.5 million, being attributed to just 112 patients. And last year, the top 10 products encompassed 104 patients. So we're seeing growth in cost as well as growth in the utilization. And this is likely a trend that I believe will continue into the future as more patients require treatments for rare disease and potentially as these products may receive approvals for new indications. Now, our next section takes a look at the impact of drug adherence on disease progression. So before we get started, we've got our second polling question for the audience. Do you believe that improving adherence to treatment can reduce overall drug costs? Great, yeah, thanks for the responses there. So it does look like an overwhelming majority of the audience believes that yes, improving adherence can reduce costs. So let's continue to find out the results of our analysis. So first off, the question we asked was, does adherence impact how quickly a patient progresses from a lower cost first-line agent to higher cost biologics? And our hypothesis was that patients who are more adherent to their treatment will have a delay in progression of their disease compared to patients who are less adherent. Now, I can't take full credit for the idea of this analysis. I had heard of this out of a PBM in the United States at a conference who shared their experience of reducing their specialty growth from double digits to single digits, having put a sharp focus and a ton of resources on improving adherence to earlier line treatments. Now, of course, it's a different healthcare model and they have more end-to-end oversight, but I thought it would be interesting to see what our data shows here. So first off, what is adherence? Now, there's many ways to measure adherence, but adherence in itself is looking at how compliant patients are with their medical treatment. Are they taking it as they should, whether that's daily or weekly? Are they refilling it when they should be due, every 90 days as an example? So our focus was on rheumatoid arthritis. The first step of our analysis was identifying patients who were on biologic treatments for rheumatoid arthritis drugs today and over the past 2 years. We then flagged those patients and reviewed up to 7 years of claim history to identify the start date for first-line treatments, things like methotrexate or DMARDs. We then stratified patients into 4 groups based on the lag time, as we called it, which was the time from when they started their first-line treatment to the date they started their biologic. And we tracked their adherence to first-line treatments. So here we just have a visual of that sort of analysis where we identified patient A having started a biologic on May 17th of 2021. We looked back historically and we found that they had started their first-line treatments on April 25th, 2016. So we tracked the days when their first-line treatment initiation to the biologic start date. And if my math was correct, that's 5 years and 22 days. So we tracked adherence to these first-line drugs during that 5-year and 22-day period, as well as for all patients. So we understood what the adherence or not adherence rate was for patients who switched earlier versus those who switched later or added on therapy later. So here are the results of our analysis. And just in terms of the number of data points or patients that were reviewed, it was 3,000 individual patients, over 3,000 individual patients, so it was quite large. So first off, you'll notice the term MPR in the far right column. This refers to the mean possession ratio and is how we calculated adherence. It takes the number of days that a prescription was filled for, as an example, 90 days, and divides it by the days between fills. So as an example, if you had picked up your 90-day supply every 100 days, your MPR would be 90 divided by 100, or 0.9. And non-adherence, which is the middle column for our purposes, was any patient who had an MPR below 0.8, meaning based on their refill patterns, they had medication available for less than 80% of days. Looking at the results, we grouped them into 4 categories, as mentioned, based on how much time had passed from when they started their initial first-line treatment drug until they were started on a biologic. Now, I would say the main takeaway here is if we look at that middle section, the middle column there, is that the non-adherence rate is hovering around 20% in the basket of patients who progressed in their treatment plan and required a biologic within 2 years, compared to a non-adherence rate of only 4% in the basket of patients who did not require a biologic for 4 to 6 years post-treatment initiation. Now, there are many other confounding factors, of course, that could play a role here that we have not corrected for or matched for. That would be a much more detailed analysis, but we just wanted to see at a high level, and we feel that this data is actually extremely interesting to see how improving adherence can actually, as we expect, would delay disease progression. Now, what is the impact on cost? So going back to our polling question, the majority of you responded that yes, improving adherence can reduce overall costs, and that would be correct. While yes, in the short term, you may actually be increasing costs, most likely, as you're working to ensure patients refill and take their medication as prescribed. In the long run, it's possible that costs are reduced. So if we look at the average cost of treatment for first-line agents, you'll see that the annual cost on average on our block of business is only $195. Now, this can range anywhere from $150 to $2,000 per year overall, depending on which first-line treatments or which basket of first-line treatments is started, but our average was under $200. Now, when we compare this to the average cost of biologic agents, we see this jump to over $15,000 per year. But given dosing ranges, again, it can vary as high as $50,000 per year in medication to treat rheumatoid arthritis. So I think you'd agree that this makes a very compelling case for improving adherence. The challenge, of course, is how best to do that. Now, we have many ways of reporting on adherence, but as mentioned, the challenge would really be how do we successfully improve a patient's adherence to treatment? And I believe that that will be the next phase of what we look at, how best to do this and how best to impart changes for our plan members. We've included a few ideas here. Going back to the US example, they use a case management approach, but of course, we can't put every single person on a first-line agent for rheumatoid arthritis with a case management program. So is it, tracking adherence and flagging those who are very poorly adherent to first-line or one drug for treating rheumatoid arthritis and trying to enroll them in a case management program? Is it waiting till they're on 2 or 3 first-line agents before you do that? But just something, a point for discussion. The other piece is virtual pharmacy and digital mobile applications. So does using a digital application to refill your prescriptions serve as a reminder of when they may be due, allowing your caregivers or loved ones to keep track of you and support you in your journey on how to make sure that you are being adherent to your medication? Would that help? And so these are all, ideas. We have to see what would be best and what works in the Canadian environment, but definitely I would say it's a discussion that needs to be had. Up next is just a quick touch point on the biosimilar landscape in Canada. The main takeaway here, and this is a similar slide that we provided last year, is just to show what the provinces are doing and what sort of strategy have they taken around biosimilars. I would say the major strategies we see here are switching, and more provinces have have gone down that path in the recent 12 to 18 months. We also have provinces who have new starts to biosimilar, which is similar to a PA program where you would enroll biosimilars first for naive patients. We see formulary coverage, so reducing barriers to access for biosimilars versus originators, which may require additional forms such as prior auth or exceptional access programs. And finally, in Manitoba, we see a tiered reimbursement strategy, which is very similar to a step therapy. Now, this is where a basket of biologics would be available for access. And once you've tried and failed treatment on those biologics, a second group of biologic treatments are now available to be claimed. We've now got our legislative update touching on national pharmacare and PMPRB. The first slide here is on national pharmacare. Now, we know that on July 27th of last year, an advisory panel was convened by CADIF to help provide Health Canada with a recommended framework for developing a potential pan-Canadian prescription drug list or formulary. The panel's goal was to encourage a movement for a national formulary, providing Canadians access to prescription drugs. And their mandate was to recommend a framework for how to develop a pan-Canadian prescription drug list, as well as recommend an initial list of commonly prescribed medications. In January of this year, a discussion paper was published and requested for stakeholder feedback on 3 major sections. One was formulating the principles of the formulary. The second was developing a staged approach for creating the formulary. And the third one was opportunities to leverage and enhance existing processes. Now, this feedback period closed at the end of February of this year, and now we await the final recommendations from CADIF, which are expected shortly. They had mentioned spring 2022. So moving forward, we'll likely have a wait and see approach about the proposed recommendations from CADIF and see what kind of momentum that garners in this coming year. It will also be interesting to see how Quebec handles this national pharmacare situation, given that they have a very similar program already in place and they believe is maybe better than a national pharmacare program. So it will be interesting to see from a federal perspective, is this mandated across all provinces or is it optional? Our next slide here is on PMPRB. So just to recap the PMPRB updates, in August of 2019, amendments to the patent medicines regulations was introduced by the PMPRB board. And these amendments sought to add new price regulatory factors, add a revised list of reference countries, and change reporting requirements for specific drug categories as a few examples of some of the changes. It's definitely simplified there. As an update, in February of 2022, the Quebec Court of Appeal struck down the economic factors that they were looking to impart. They struck down the disclosure of confidential product listing agreements and confidential pricing, but they did uphold the change to comparator countries. So the basket of countries that we look to compare our pricing to was upheld by the Quebec Court of Appeal. So after that decision, as of April, PMPRB announced that it was going to be proposing a new version of the guidelines. And they're still at this date, July 1st, 2022, in terms of coming into force on what the amendments will be. So we're waiting to see what those amendments will finally look like, and if the July 1st date will still be a go, as it's only a couple of months away. Our next section here is COVID-19 insights and looking at the potential impact COVID had on patients seeking care, as well as their behaviors as to where prescriptions were dispensed. So we've heard from many experts that Canadians were not seeking medical advice throughout the pandemic for a variety of reasons, whether it was being unsure if it was safe to go to the emergency room or to visit your primary care practitioner. Were they uncertain about speaking about their condition virtually, and so they were waiting for in-person visits to resume. And so we wanted to look at our block of business to understand the potential impact of what our plan members have been dealing with. And we can see here across these 3 categories, so cancer, depression, and cardio-cholesterol, a large jump in 2021 of new starts or delayed diagnoses potentially. So we define a new diagnosis as the first time a patient has started on therapy in a particular class with no claims in the recent past within that disease state. So highlighting cancer here, we saw about a 25% increase. We see a year-over-year increase from 18 to 19, a leveling off in 2020, and then a large jump in 2021. And this may have been the natural progression anyways, in terms of the number of patients, but we saw that it sort of paused in 2020. And so what does this mean? It may mean that patients have progressed into later stages of cancer before they were diagnosed, and that will have downstream impacts. The next category we looked at here is depression, and we saw over 50% increase in new patients. And this could be the effect of COVID-19, but also combined with patients who may not have sought treatment during those 2019 and 2020 years. And finally, cardio-cholesterol. We also saw over 50% increase in new patients into this category. Now, this one is interesting because it's typically silent, and unless you have a routine screening or regular checkups, you may not know that you have high cholesterol or elevated blood pressure. So this one doesn't surprise me that we're seeing such a large jump as patients start to get back to seeing their physicians and get back to routine screening and checkups. So the impacts of delayed diagnoses. As I mentioned with cancer, diagnosed at a later state of disease, they may be harder to treat. We may start to see the use of higher cost later line treatments earlier on in the course of treatment. It's also possible that the disease state is more complex and multiple factors now beyond just the one. As an example, with delayed blood pressure treatments or a delayed in diabetes diagnosis, it can have downstream effects and other disease states start to creep in. The next thing we want to look at was plan member behavior as it related to their decisions to where they were filling prescriptions. We looked at two baskets of pharmacies, those which were mail order or virtual pharmacy, and the remaining which we've identified as your traditional retail pharmacy. We looked across three metrics: the number of claimants, as you'll see on this slide, the total number of claims, as well as the total costs transacting through each type of pharmacy. As we see here, and we used Q4 2018 as our baseline, we saw 500% growth in the number of claimants utilizing at least once a virtual pharmacy. On this slide, that's just looking at the total number of claims, we saw close to 300% growth in the number of claims transacted through virtual or mail order pharmacies. So what this tells me is that many of the new users to a virtual pharmacy may be on fewer medications overall, because we had a 500% growth in users, but only a 300% growth in volume. And so this could signal that not only are those patients who have a large number of medications utilizing virtual pharmacies where they may be getting their prescriptions and pill packs, but also those who have occasional prescriptions or only one or two, maybe just an asthma inhaler here and there, are leveraging virtual pharmacies. So there's definitely a trend in this direction. And finally here, we have a look at the cost, the total eligible amount. So what's interesting is to see the growth rate here north of 1,700%. So this would signal a high number of specialty or high cost treatments being dispensed through virtual pharmacy. Now, this number really stood out compared to the previous two charts. And so we, again, took a deeper dive just to understand what was happening. And what we noted was that in 2020, a virtual pharmacy or mail order pharmacy in Quebec came to market with a focus on specialty medications. So this one location is driving the majority of the 1,700% growth in cost from those dispensed at a virtual or mail order pharmacy. If we had excluded that one pharmacy from this slide, you would see a similar 300 to 500% growth range. Now, up next is our final section for the day, which is the drug pipeline, where we'll provide you with a view into pipeline drugs for 4 disease states, being Alzheimer's disease, macular degeneration, atopic dermatitis, and multiple sclerosis. But before we get started, we've got our third and final polling question for the audience. And this one is, which therapeutic area is seeing the most phase 2 or 3 clinical trials? Is it ophthalmology, infectious disease, oncology, or immunology? Great, so we've got 55% selecting oncology as their guess. And so as with the other two questions, let's continue on to find out. So just before we get into the answer for our polling question, I would say that we're going to take a look at specific categories. We just wanted to share a view on the drug pipeline starting at phase 1. So as you can see, there are over 16,000 molecules or trials across phase 1, 2, and 3. Now, as we would expect, not all molecules make it into phase 3, which is why we see the lowest number there. But this serves to show that the pipeline is full and we can continue to expect to see new products come to market well into the future. So here we have a view of the development pipeline by therapeutic area and the answer to our final polling question. So for those of you who selected oncology, you're correct. Oncology by far is the most researched area that we've seen based on this data. coming in at nearly double the number of trials compared to the second most research area being infectious disease. So given that the oncology class is having a lot of research and a lot of, there will be a lot of pipeline drugs coming in this area, we took a look at our claims data in 2021 and focused in on some of the newer treatments being monoclonal antibodies and targeted therapies. Now, these would include things like Keytruda, Opdivo, Alisonsero, and Lynparza. So looking at our first group here, we actually see a reduction in the number of claimants by nearly 20% and a reduction in overall cost by 5%. So this would be the opposite of what we would probably expect, knowing that there's this much research and a big push to develop new oncology treatments. So this is likely due to a variety of factors. It could be that patients are moving on to different therapies, patients are starting treatment on different therapies. But one we thought that made sense is the involvement of the provincial payer. Typically, provinces are delayed in their coverage decision compared to private payers, where coverage decisions are typically made available closer to when the drug comes to market. So this does show that potentially, while private plans may be required to pick up the cost of treatment early on when a drug comes to market, it is possible that a claim would then shift to the public payer should the drug be added to various provincial drug programs, such as cancer programs specifically. The next group we looked at, which is the targeted therapies. Here, we just want to highlight that the cost of treatment is showing high cost or specialty, where we see 8% of claimants make up 20% of the cost in the category. And we're also seeing that certain products which come to market starting off as later line treatments or end stage cancer treatments may now be used in earlier line of therapy, leading to patients being on treatment for a longer duration on these higher cost drugs. And this may be another reason we're seeing growth in the oncology class. So now we're going to jump into our 4 sort of disease states. The first one our focus on is Alzheimer's disease. So here we're looking at the product Aduhelm, as the name is in the United States. Now, this is a product for Alzheimer's. Its Canadian approval is expected later in the spring or early summer. This drug was approved in the United States in June of 2021. The approval here was controversial, mainly because the data from clinical trials and subgroup analysis was being questioned, and they're trying to understand the right population. But it's possible that this drug may be used in a younger population with very early disease and mild symptoms. In the United States, the cost of this product is approximately $56,000 per year. We also see additional candidates for treating Alzheimer's disease coming over the next 3 to 5 years potentially. So this is a class to keep an eye on. The next one is macular degeneration. So here we wanted to show that there's the 2 main products here that we're looking at are Lucentis and Eylea, which are existing products. A biosimilar for Lucentis is already approved as of March 2022, and a biosimilar for Eylea is possible within the next 2 years in 2024. That being said, there are a couple of new products that could be entrants this year, one being Susvimo, which is a United States name, which is a similar molecule to Lucentis, but it's an implant. And so this could change, where we would expect shift or savings into biosimilars. Patients may shift to Susvimo, potentially the name of it. The other one is Faricimab as another entrant potentially in 2022. Now, this is also an injectable, but it has a longer duration of action, so there would be fewer injections for the patients. Our next category is atopic dermatitis, and there have been recent approvals for Atralza and Rinvoq in this category. We had initially thought that there would be a potential for cost savings versus Dupixent, which is an existing product in this category, but Health Canada ended up approving Rinvoq as a later line than expected, so the cost savings with the product would not be realized for first line or early line treatments. And finally, we're looking at multiple sclerosis. So with multiple sclerosis, the arrival of generic versions of Tecfidera came in late of 2021 and brought immediate savings, but not enough for us to realize kind of in year. It was very late in Q4. But in 2020 and as well in 2021, Tecfidera represented on our block of business approximately $33 million in eligible costs per year. So with the generic offering anywhere between 50 to 75% savings based on the province, the savings here can be quite significant on this one product alone. There is, however, a new product which is similar to Tecfidera, we believe will be named Vumerity, which offers an improved side effect profile. It is still waiting to be approved by Health Canada, but patients who may be suffering from side effect, specifically GI side effects on Tecfidera, may end up being switched over to this product once approved, offsetting some of the savings that would have been expected from generics of Tecfidera, but obviously providing improved side effect profile for patients. So I'll just wrap this up with a few key messages. The first one being the pipeline for top therapy classes remains strong. As we've seen, there's many entrants into existing classes, but also new mechanisms of action. So it'll be really interesting to see what these drugs look like when they come to market. What is their value proposition compared to existing treatments, and what is their price point? The next one is plan management tools do exist to support plan sustainability. We covered a couple of plan management options for inflammatory diseases as well as diabetes. And all of these are available to support individual categories, and there's a variety of programs available. So it's definitely something to look at. My third takeaway or key message is that it's really important to evaluate pipeline drugs from both a clinical and cost effectiveness. As we mentioned, high-cost drugs can bring value to private payers. So it's not only about evaluating the clinical and just that fixed sort of absolute dollar value, but what is the value that you're getting for that dollar amount, making high-cost drugs potentially valuable, even though the overall figure may look like a large number. Our fourth takeaway or key message is the impact of COVID-19. So what will be the impact of these new or delayed diagnoses of treatment over the next 1 or 2 years on drug plans as well as plan member health? Will we see, in fact, that patients have progressed in their disease prior to being identified, meaning later line treatments are going to be started sort of earlier on, as we would say? And my final key message really is that adherence matters. We saw from that analysis at a high level that adherence to initial treatments may delay disease progression or treatment switch to high-cost biologics. And as it's shown, delaying progression by even 1 year could save around $15,000 when we look at an average cost, while also potentially, it's beneficial for the plan members because they're also delaying the disease progression. So there's, both sides are incentivized here to become more adherent. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Vishal, for a very informative presentation. It's now time for Q&A. As a reminder, we invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A panel accessible on the right side of your window. So your first question, Vishal. So you talked about impacts of COVID-19 to sort of other areas, but what are the impacts of medications prescribed for COVID, and how did this impact private plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say drugs that were specifically indicated for COVID were mostly picked up by federal emergency programs or provincial programs. But where we did see some impact, I would say, was early on some of those drugs that were, early on, there's a lot of hype around hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin as an example. So we did see an increase in use of those products early on, but now where we have actual indicated treatments for COVID-19, most of them are picked up by federal programs.
Thank you. So the next question is around the inflammatory disease class. How will the trend in costs for infliximab, for example, change the recent Quebec switch policy?
Yeah, so I believe the Quebec switch policy is to the biosimilar. So depending on what percentage, since we're looking at a national level, it may have some impact. Of course, as more and more provinces put in switching programs, that will start to bend the curve, I would say. We won't see it go as quickly, but again, something to keep in mind and look at again next year, but likely we'll see a bend in the curve, but we might still see growth.
So the next question is, the estimated, similarly related to biosimilars, the estimated 3.82% of savings by implementing plan management solutions in the anti-inflammatory therapeutic area, how was that percentage calculated? Especially when most biosimilars are priced at half or a quarter of the original cost. Is it based more in prevalence per plan or something along those lines?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. So essentially there, just to keep it really simple, we took all of the claims that were for an originator for which biosimilars were available. And we said if we were to only reimburse those up to the biosimilar price, so whether it's through PLA, PA program, hard or soft switching, what would that savings dollar be? So, and then that 3.82% is on the overall block or overall exposure in terms of eligible costs across all drug claims.
So the next question is around the continuous glucose monitor data. With CGM coverage now under government plans, how do you see this affecting private insurers?
Yeah, I believe RAMQ has added coverage for Dexcom to their plan. Again, I believe there are some parameters for when it is eligible. And so in that case, in Quebec, we'll likely see uptake because it's now part of RAMQ. So all private payers must align with that coverage when they meet the criteria. In the rest of the country, again, it would be similar to when a public plan picks up a drug. It's not always, picked up within the drug plan. It could be from a different basket or a different budget, not necessarily the drug budget. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But for sure in Quebec, I would expect to see uptake of the product through 2022.
Thank you. So staying in the diabetic realm, are there tools to help manage diabetic patients who are on oral or injectable medications?
Yeah, for sure. So I did mention the step therapy that we were looking at for flash or continuous glucose sensors. We also have a step therapy program to manage those oral and injectable drugs for typically type 2 diabetics. We would exclude insulin from that, but it'd be a very similar setup where we would look at the progression of a typical diabetic, as metformin as a first line, and then unlocking the rest of the product. So yeah, that is an option.
Okay, and so along those lines again, how are quantity limits determined for diabetic medications?
Oh, right, yeah. So the quantity limits that we spoke about as a plan management solution, we took the maximum diabetic dose for those three products and multiplied it out through the year. So if there was a weekly dose or a daily dose, we looked at what would it take over 52 weeks or 365 days. And that's where we would, land as a quantity limit. I would say you'd probably want to include plus or like plus 5 or 10%, just, given when someone refills the drug. It may be in year, maybe the next year. So you don't want that to cause an impact, but that's essentially how it was calculated.
Great, thanks. So the next question is, are those top 10 most costly products covered under provincial programs?
It would vary by province, I would say. Some of them may have specific specialty drug programs which cover for rare diseases, but it would be province specific. And I don't think all of them would have coverage.
So just switching gears toward the data that you had around virtual pharmacies and mail order pharmacies, can you please clarify what is considered a virtual pharmacy? Also, is the increase due to more patients seeing their doctors virtually over the pandemic?
Yeah, so I guess the first part of that question, we looked at pharmacies who offered a mail order only service, typically not a brick and mortar store that you can walk in, and we grouped them as virtual or mail order, and everybody else fell into the traditional or retail model. And yeah, it's a great question. I would say maybe yes, depending on partnerships that exist with virtual care providers. If they have a partnership with a local pharmacy or a network of pharmacies, it's very likely that the script may have gone direct and then shipped to your front door. So that's sort of a seamless experience. For sure, that can, I think, just the overall digitization and virtualization of care can also promote virtual pharmacy.
Are the virtual pharmacy stats only from the TELUS Health virtual pharmacy, or other virtual pharmacies are included in that analysis as well?
Yeah, great question. So it was the basket of mail order or virtual pharmacy, so not just the TELUS virtual pharmacy.
Okay, so the next question is what role does or could the TELUS pharmacy, I'm guessing the TELUS virtual pharmacy, play in further containing costs when a generic drug is introduced in expensive specialty drug categories like multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think most pharmacies, especially the TELUS virtual pharmacy, always want to ensure they're offering the generic product to their patients, unless the patient or plan member is specifically requesting the brand. Typically, the generic will be substituted automatically, as is allowed through regulations across Canada. And so that's how I would say, once a generic's available, that discussion will happen with the plan member the next time they come for a refill. And that's how I would say they could support the generic use for sure.
That's great. I think that brings us to our last question. Thank you, Vishal. Great Q&A session and a very informative presentation.